Hi, everybody. I'm going to give you a review of the book called The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave. It was the book that he wrote after he wrote about his life after escaping slavery. So Frederick begins the book off telling that he was born in Tuckahoe, Maryland, in Talbot County. In the beginning of the book, he talks about his life in slavery. He describes his childhood. He describes how the kids were treated, how the adult slaves were treated. He talked about how they were fed, how they were clothed. He talked about how he saw people getting whipped. He talked about how he saw slave owners who had their way sexually with female slaves. He talked about things like how when a slave owner died, they had something called the valuation, where they were lined up with all these slave owners' property, and they were sold or either divvied up amongst the slave owners' children. So at some point during Frederick's childhood, he was moved to Baltimore to live with his new slave owner. He said one thing he noticed, that in the city, Baltimore was a city, slave owners treated their slaves a little bit differently. Although they were still enslaved, they treated them better. He said he thought that the slaves in the city kind of acted like they were free, basically, whereas in the rural slave area where they had slaves on a plantation, basically, they were treated worse, from what I can gather from what he was saying. Okay, while he was living in Baltimore, he was living with a slave master and his wife, and the slave woman herself, the slave owner, his wife, never had owned slaves or didn't grow up with slaves and that type of thing. She started teaching Frederick how to read. She started teaching him his ABC. She started to teach him words and things like that. He says that he felt very comfortable around her. The other slaves didn't have to put their head down around her, that type of thing. So one day her husband came home and saw her teaching Frederick how to read. He basically gave her a scolding, told her that in no circumstance was she ever to teach a slave how to read again. Slaves would become unmanageable if they were continued to taught how to read. They would be spoiled. They would be uncontrollable. So this was an eye-opening experience for Frederick. This opened his eyes. This let him know what was being hid from him. This created a hunger and a thirst for knowledge. From that point on, he knew that he had to seek knowledge. Next thing is he was eventually moved back to his original plantation. I believe it was like a 7-year period where he lived in Baltimore. He went back to his original plantation. He says this was very difficult, I think, because he had gotten a taste of being a city type of slave. When he went back to the plantation, his slave owner was very mean. He says that the slave owner had started to feel like Frederick was unmanageable. So what he did was he sent Frederick to live with a man named Mr. Covey, who was a slave breaker. This slave breaker, basically, he said he was there not a week and the slave owner whipped him. He says he whipped him pretty much every day, almost for every little thing he did wrong. He whipped him. He whipped him. Not a week went by he didn't get a whipping. This is like the most he ever had been whipped in his life. He says in the book that the slave breaker a slave breaker, just to give you a key, was somebody in the community who plantation owners sent slaves to live with, who were like slaves that were considered hard to control. And this person would basically break the slave and then send them back to their slave owner. He was to live with this slave breaker named Mr. Covey for 1 year. He says that Mr. Covey did succeed in breaking him. He was broken spiritually, mentally, and physically. Okay, to the point where he even ran away back to his slave owner and complained, hey, this guy's really, really beating me to death. He's going to kill me, I think. And he says, well, no, Mr. Covey's a good man. You're to live with him for a year. So he went back. He ended up going back to Mr. Covey's house. As soon as he got back, he was ready to whoop him again, basically. Met him at the door. So eventually, Frederick was doing like this fanning. He was working with this fanning system, and that he had to like keep working. And to like he and another slave were working on. He got tired. Was like, I can't do this anymore, and he stopped. When he stopped working, Mr. Covey ran down and like, hey, what's going on? Why aren't you working anymore? The system needs to keep going. So this turned out to be a situation where Frederick and Mr. Covey got into a fight. He says that the fight lasted about 2 hours. He says that he felt he got the better of Mr. Covey, left him bloody, beat him up, kind of like, they beat each other up, but he felt like he won. Usually when a slave would rebel against their breaker or against the slave owner, they would take him to the middle of town and whip them bad, like in front of everybody to set example. He says Mr. Covey never told. He says because he didn't want to ruin his reputation as a slave breaker. He knew if another slave revolted against him and won, that would ruin his reputation. So eventually he left Mr. Covey's, the breaker, and he went back to Baltimore. When he went back to Baltimore, he asked his slave owners, could he employ himself? So he was allowed to employ himself. He had to give the money that he made to the slave owners, or he had to pay them like a certain amount. This really gave him a bad taste in his mouth. He said the one job he had, he was making $6 a week, and the slave owner would take all of it. And he would give him, sometimes he'd give him 6 cents back. This really left a bad taste in his mouth. He started to think more and more about escaping. He looked around all the time for routes to escape. That was on his mind constantly. Eventually, on September 3rd, he says he left his chains and he did escape. He ended up going more up north. He met some white folk who helped him out. One's name was Mr. Ruggles. While he was with Mr. Ruggles, he brought his wife. He sent for his wife, his soon-to-be wife. They were then married. They stayed with Mr. Ruggles for a while. They then left there and went to a place, and they lived with a man named Mr. Johnson. This is where he got his name, Frederick Douglass. That wasn't his original name. So he allowed this guy named Mr. Johnson to name him when he escaped from slavery. Once he left Mr. Johnson, he ended up going to another place, I believe New Bedford or Newport, and he started reading a newspaper called The Liberator. He says as he began to continue to read The Liberator, he became more passionate because he saw stories about anti-slavery. He became more passionate about it, wanted to learn more about it. He really took a hold of this, and at one of the anti-slavery meetings that he was at, he was asked. It was August 11th, I believe, 1841. I believe he gave his first speech at an anti-slavery meeting. So that's kind of like what this book was about. It was about Frederick's life from when he was a child as a slave to when he finally escaped slavery. So this is a review of the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. A Story of an American Slave was written by Frederick Douglass. This is just a quick summary. Thank you.